Hello and welcome to this video tutorial from CG Toots. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and today I'm going to be taking you through some basic Toon style rendering for our character here in Blender 2.49. Now, the basis of what we're going to be doing are adding and adjusting several materials for each of the different elements of our character here. Then we'll also be using a very basic lighting setup and also looking at some rendering techniques, and finally looking at a very basic node setup to add some final polish. So first things first, let's go in and start adjusting the materials. Or actually first, let's add a lighting setup. Now if we hit render right now, we're not going to see much. We can see we just have a black scene. And this is because we don't have any lighting whatsoever in our scene. First, let's go ahead and start by adding some ambient occlusion to add some even out lighting. And so we first want to go to the shading or materials panel, and then go on over to the world buttons. And first thing we need to, normally there's a world by default, and for some reason I don't have it on. And in this case, we're just going to add, we can just change all of this to solid white or black. It doesn't matter, as we're not going to be using it. The main thing we want to look at is the ambient occlusion. So let's just turn on ambient occlusion. And then there's two different methods that we can look at. We can either use the approximate method or the ray trace method. The approximate is faster but doesn't give as accurate results, while the ray trace is much slower and noisier based on lower samples, but gives a much finer result if you increase the samples. Today we're just going to be looking at approximate as it suits our needs fine. Then we're also going to enable both so that it both darkens the dark areas and lightens the light areas. And then we're going to change our energy down to about 0.6, just so it's not too overwhelming. Now let's hit render now and see what we get. Okay, this is looking good. And so you can see we just have a single dark gray character. But let's go ahead and add some lighting to this now to better see our character. So from the front view, with 1 on my keyboard, I'm going to hit spacebar, add lamp, spot. And we're just going to use a single spotlight for this character. And this is because since we're doing toon shading, we want everything to be very, very smooth and even. And so I can just scale this up, move it around, and position it. A handy trick is to hit P, or period, on your keyboard, and with your cursor center by hitting Shift-C, you can then rotate your lamp around the cursor to better position it with ease. And if we now hit render, okay, that's starting to look better. But we want to go ahead and continue to smooth this out. So let's go ahead and change this over to ray shadow, and let's increase our energy to about 1.5. That'll brighten it up a little bit. Okay, and now just because I'm rendering at a larger size than my recording dimension, I'm just going to turn my rendering size down to 75%. That way we don't see the anti-aliasing, or the aliasing, my bad. Okay, now let's start looking at our material so that we can start getting some toon effects in this. Let's first start with just the body, and so we're just going to select it by right-clicking. And let's go to the shading panel and click Add New. And we'll just call this Skin. It really doesn't matter. And the three things that we're going to be looking at in order to get the effect that we want. Number 1, the color. Number 2, the shading here, and for the diffuse shader. And number 3, the specular shader. First, let's grab our color. Let's just grab a nice skin tone. Somewhere in this range. It's maybe a little too pink. There we are, and then we'll just click render and see what we get. Okay, that should be good for our skin tone. It's maybe a little too dark. Okay, that ought to work. And now let's go ahead and go in and add our diffuse shader to Toon. Now you'll immediately notice that it adds this dark area around here. And let's just click render just to see what we get so we can compare. And notice we get this really nasty effect where it's bringing all these darks except for on the highlights. Well, this is cool if we adjust the settings. And so let's go in and we're just going to use the reflection at the default 0.8, which is the amount of light the material is reflecting. And then we have the size, which you can see affects the size of the dark areas. And we're going to put it to 1.2. And then lastly, let's look at the smooth value, and it defines how smooth or sharp the edge between the two are. And we're going to put it at 0.05, just to give it a nice sharp outline, but just smooth it out just a tiny bit so we don't see a jagged edge. And hitting render, we can start to see that's looking pretty sweet. But you'll notice that the specularity is really messing things up. We don't like this at all. And so let's go on to that. Now with the default value, we get this smooth specular shader, which is great, but in this case, we really don't want it. And so let's change this over to Toon. And you'll immediately notice it adds a sharp specular highlight. So this is much, much better. But by default, it's far, far too strong. And so let's change the specularity down to, let's do 0.02, our size to 0.8, and the size and smoothness on this do the same thing as on the diffuse shader. There we go, that's starting to look a lot better. But the specularity on this is maybe a little too low. Let's put this at 0.04 maybe, and check that out. That's a little better. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and leave that as is. I'm going to save my file. And then we're going to use this as a basis for each of our other materials. Let's go ahead and start out with the pants here. And so we're just going to bring this up and grab our skin right here. You'll notice I've got some other materials in here from when I was testing this. Just ignore those for the time being. Pretend they don't exist. But let's go ahead and name this. We'll just name it yellow, as we're going to use a yellow color for the pants. And we go grab this. Let's grab a nice kind of burnt yellow. Something about like that. And then just click render. Now, you'll notice that I made a mistake, obviously, in that I forgot to separate out the skin material from the pants material. And so we can fix this real quick by clicking this little 2 right here, make a single user, and then reselect the body, rename it to skin again, and reset our skin tone. So we'll just grab that real quick. Get a nice skin color. There we go. And now let's click render. It's good, particularly when adjusting materials, to render often so that you continually see what you're getting, because a lot of times it's just the littlest tiny tweak that really nails down the character. And I feel like that's a little dull right now. Okay, so we're going to leave that as is. On the pants, we're going to turn, well, let's see, let's just check this out. No, we're going to leave that just as is. And so now, let's go ahead and select everything else. And we'll go ahead and grab our yellow. And we're going to click the 2. And we're going to call this dark. And we're going to give it a nice dark gray. There we go. And then lastly, since we're using the same settings, these are the same as my test ones as well, I'm going to grab these, and you can actually see they're already applied, and these are just the little stripes, and applied to the white. And the white is the exact same thing, just set completely white. And I need to put that size down to 1.2. And so now we can hit render. Starting to look pretty darn good. But we want to go ahead and take this a little further. And the way that we can do this is using the node editor. The node editor is going to allow us to add in the outline effect that you commonly see on Toon characters like this, and also add in a nice background image. Now, some of you may be asking, why use the node editor for doing the edge rendering? Since if we just go over to our render buttons and click edge and edge settings, we already have it. Well, unfortunately, the edge settings in Blender, no offense to whoever coded them a long time ago, they're terrible, simply based on the fact that they don't give you enough control. That, and they only have, they go from 1 to whatever size, and the 1 is not small enough for most people's taste. So we're going to use the node editor to replicate this effect, but with more control. And so there are a couple things we need to do. First off, let's save it, and then let's click Do Composite, and then right here we're also going to change this to pre-multiply. And this means it's going to pre-multiply the alpha value of the character, effectively taking out the world background before we render. Before we render, or at rendering time. And this will allow us to add in a background image a lot easier. And so, now that we've done that, let's just switch this window here over to our node editor. And then I'm just going to hit Shift Space to make that full screen. And we're going to click Use Nodes and Backdrop. Now, Use Nodes obviously just tells it to use the compositing nodes, which be sure to select the compositing nodes here. And then we have our render layer, or our rendered input, as you can see here, and our final composite node here. Now, I'm not going to make this too much of an introduction to nodes themselves. There's a lot of tutorials on that, as we don't want to take up too much time. But the way that we're going to do this is we're going to hit spacebar, add, and we're going to add a filter, dilate, and erode. And what this is going to allow us to do is take the alpha value from our render layer, which if we add a viewer node, you can see that the alpha is a solid black and white. Now, if we take this, and we're going to duplicate the viewer node so that we can see the effect, if we take this, we can think, let's inverse this and just grow it 1 pixel. And so we can just click distance, and you can see it expands the white on this. Well, this is all fine and dandy, except that we don't want white, we want a black outline. And so let's hit spacebar, add, color, invert. And then we'll just connect this here. And we'll just duplicate the viewer and connect it here. And you can duplicate it by just clicking on it to select, left click, and Shift D, just like you would duplicate anything else. And so now we have a black outline. Well, this is great. Now let's mix the two together. And so let's hit spacebar, add, color, mix. And we're going to, the bottom one is always going to be what's on top, and then the top one is what's beneath, dependent on the alpha. And so let's bring in our image here. We'll select that, and we're going to duplicate our viewer once more so we can see what we're doing. And you'll notice that the backdrop grabs the active viewer. Now currently this is being mixed with a medium gray at 50%, so it's taking the 50% alpha of each of them and mixing them together. We want to go ahead and mix it with this, and so let's just pull in our second color here, and now you can see it's mixing those two together. Now you can see immediately we've got this really nice outline effect going on. However, we don't want it to dole out everything else. And so using our alpha value, we can think, okay, so we need something exactly like this, but reversed, so that because remember with alphas, black is transparent, white is opaque. And so we want to exclude the background on this. Well, this is very easy. Let's just grab this, pull this in as our factor, and there we have it. That gives a very nice outline effect. Everything's still sharp as can be. But let's do one last thing to really polish off this effect. Let's go ahead and add a background image. And I'm just going to add a simple background gradient. And so I'm going to hit spacebar, input, image. And I've already created this image. Now you could use a texture or what have you, but in this case I'm using an image. And so I'm going to click load new and just grab the background gradient. And this should be included with the source files. We're going to grab our mix node, hit Shift D to duplicate it. We'll duplicate our viewer as well just so we can see what we're doing. We'll connect those two. And then let's pull in this image here and put it on the bottom. We'll pull in our gradient here as the top, and we can see what we're getting. And so let's go ahead and pull in the same alpha value here to mix those two. And now you can see we have this very nice gradient effect. Now, that being said, the size value is getting being troublesome, and this is simply because I'm rendering at 75% in Blender. Now I do believe that there is a way to make it so that this does not affect the size, but we're not going to worry about that for the time being, because if I go ahead and change my render value up to 100%, click render, and then we can see it should line up just perfectly. As you can see, it does. And this is because my background gradient is the same size as my final render output. And so the last thing we need to do is just pull in our final node and connect it to the composite, such that when we hit render again, it'll actually composite all of the effects after rendering and leave us with our final result, as you can see here. And so there you have it. There is some Toon style rendering in Blender. Very simple, very easy, and really quite effective. You know, obviously you could play with this if you wanted some of these edges a little more sharper, decrease the smoothness, or if you wanted more dark, increase the size, etc. And so there's a lot that you can do with it without having to write any custom shaders. And there you have it. Quite effective, and frankly, I think it looks pretty darn good. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you next time.